Subscribe now and press the bell icon so you never miss an emotional story that touches your heart. On a cold morning in March, the National History Museum of London was bustling with activity. Tourists from around the world walked through the grand corridors, their eyes wide with wonder as they gazed upon centuries-old artifacts and paintings. The museum was hosting a special educational event that would bring together two of the most unusual competitors, a royal guard and a history teacher. What started as a simple trivia competition would turn into something far more memorable. James Hartford was a man of precision and discipline. For the past 15 years, he had served as one of the Queen's Guard at Buckingham Palace. Every morning, he put on his iconic red uniform and stood tall outside the palace gates. Enduring the curious stares and camera flashes from thousands of visitors, his days were long, his posture unwavering, and his commitment absolute. James had dedicated his life to tradition and duty. However, what many people did not know was that beneath that stoic exterior, James possessed a sharp and curious mind. The history teacher, Dr. Elizabeth Moore, had built her reputation over 20 years of teaching at a prestigious London school. She was known throughout the education community as a brilliant scholar who had published numerous books on European history and medieval cultures. Dr. Moore had spent countless hours in libraries and archives, collecting knowledge like precious gems. Her students adored her classes because she brought history alive with dramatic stories and passionate lectures. She had never lost a quiz competition in her entire career. Her confidence was well-earned, and her determination was absolutely unshakable. The museum's director had organized this event as part of a fundraising campaign. The concept was simple yet innovative: bring two people from completely different backgrounds and have them compete in a series of history challenges. The winner would receive a substantial donation to their chosen charity, and the loser would be a good sport about it. Most people in the audience that day assumed Dr. Moore would win without any difficulty. After all, she was a published expert, while James was just a guard who stood at a gate all day. The audience was filled with hundreds of people who came to watch what they believed would be an easy victory for the brilliant historian. As James walked onto the stage that morning, he felt the weight of countless eyes upon him. The audience seemed skeptical. He could see the doubt written across their faces. Some people whispered to their neighbors, probably laughing at the idea that a palace guard could possibly compete with a university-educated historian. James understood their skepticism completely. He did not look like a scholar. He did not carry himself like someone who spent nights reading dusty books. But James had a secret that nobody in that audience knew. Years ago, when James first joined the Palace Guard, he had felt incredibly bored during the long hours of standing still. The other guards would chat with each other during their breaks, but James wanted to do something more productive with his time. He discovered that he could listen to audiobooks while performing his duties, keeping his composure intact while his mind traveled through history. He had spent years absorbing knowledge from thousands of hours of historical content. He read military history, cultural history, royal genealogy, and everything in between. James had become an expert through unconventional means, but his knowledge was just as comprehensive as any academic's. The competition was structured in 3 rounds. The first round would be a rapid-fire question session where they would be asked 50 questions, each worth 1 point. The second round would involve identifying historical artifacts and explaining their significance. The final round would be a creative challenge, where they would need to solve a historical mystery using clues provided by the judges. Dr. Moore stretched her fingers, as if she were preparing for a piano performance. She looked confident and completely at ease. James simply smiled, remembering all those nights he had spent learning. All those hours of preparation that nobody knew about. The museum fell silent as the host stepped up to the microphone. The audience leaned forward in their seats, eager to see how this unusual match would unfold. Camera flashes went off occasionally, and people in the crowd whispered excitedly to each other. The energy was electric, full of anticipation and curiosity. James took a deep breath and prepared himself mentally for what was about to happen. This was his moment to show that knowledge and intelligence had nothing to do with a person's job or their appearance. This was his chance to prove that dedication and passion for learning could come from anywhere. In any form, regardless of what a person did for a living, Dr. Moore adjusted her glasses and smiled at the audience. She was ready for this competition, and she fully expected to dominate it. She had never felt nervous before an academic challenge in her entire life. The host welcomed everyone to the event and explained the rules once more to the audience. Then he turned to face the two competitors and asked if they were ready. James nodded calmly, while Dr. Moore gave a confident thumbs up. The audience erupted in enthusiastic applause and cheers. The competition was about to begin, and nobody in that room could predict what would happen next. Everyone assumed they knew the outcome already, but they were completely wrong about what was about to unfold before their eyes. The first question came quickly. Which Tudor king famously broke with the Roman Catholic Church to marry Anne Boleyn? The host spoke rapidly, and Dr. Moore's hand shot up immediately. She answered confidently, Henry VIII, and received a point. James buzzed in on the second question about the Norman conquest, and he answered correctly as well. The pace accelerated rapidly as question after question poured from the host's mouth. The audience watched in amazement as both competitors kept answering correctly, point after point accumulating on their respective boards. 15 questions into the round, something surprising began to happen. James was matching Dr. Moore's answers perfectly. He was not stumbling or guessing. He was responding with clear, accurate information and displaying a depth of knowledge that left several members of the audience looking stunned. The skepticism that had filled the room just moments earlier began to fade, replaced by genuine curiosity and intrigue. People were no longer assuming the outcome. They were actually paying attention to what was happening on that stage, watching carefully as both competitors proved themselves to be formidable opponents. By the 25th question, the score was exactly tied. Neither competitor had made a single mistake. The tension in the room grew palpable as the host continued firing questions. Dr. Moore's confident expression had shifted slightly. There was a subtle change in her eyes, a recognition that this was not going to be the easy victory she had anticipated. James remained calm and composed, just as he always was when standing at the palace gates. His years of training had taught him how to maintain his composure under pressure, and this skill was serving him incredibly well in this competition. The host asked a particularly difficult question about the Byzantine Empire. Who was the most famous Byzantine emperor known for his military victories and legal reforms? James buzzed in first, his fingers striking the button with perfect timing. Justinian I, he answered clearly and correctly. The audience actually gasped. Some people stood up in their seats, craning their necks to get a better view of the guards on stage. This was no longer just a trivia game. This had become a genuine contest between two intellectually formidable individuals. The museum director sat in the front row with wide eyes, hardly believing what was unfolding before him. Dr. Moore answered the next 3 questions correctly, earning back some points. Then James answered 2 in a row about medieval warfare and European medieval politics. The lead changed hands multiple times as the first round continued. With just 10 questions remaining, they were still perfectly tied, each holding 35 points. The atmosphere had transformed completely from a light-hearted entertainment event into something that felt genuinely important. People were taking notes, discussing answers with their neighbors, and showing real interest in the competition itself rather than just the novelty of it. The final 10 questions tested different areas of history with relentless speed. One question asked about the French Revolution, another about the American Civil War, a third about ancient Egypt. James and Dr. Moore took turns answering, their knowledge seeming almost endless. The audience was now fully invested in the outcome. This was no longer about proving who was smarter between a guard and a teacher. This had become about respecting and acknowledging genuine expertise and passion for learning, regardless of where that person worked. When the final question was asked, James answered it correctly just a split second before Dr. Moore could respond. The first round ended with James holding 48 points and Dr. Moore holding 47 points. The crowd burst into applause, and this time the applause was not condescending or mocking. It was respectful and genuinely impressed. Dr. Moore rose from her seat and actually shook James's hand, her expression showing clear surprise, but also appreciation for his performance. The host announced the scores to the audience and read them aloud over the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, it appears we have an extremely close competition. James Hartford from the Royal Guard is leading by just 1 point going into the second round. The audience erupted in cheers. This was no longer a predictable event where everyone knew how it would end. This had become something genuinely exciting and unpredictable. The museum director was smiling broadly, clearly delighted that his event had turned into something far more entertaining and meaningful than he had ever imagined. During the brief intermission before the second round, Dr. Moore approached James and asked him how he had acquired such extensive historical knowledge. James explained his system of audiobooks and dedicated study over many years. Dr. Moore listened carefully, and her expression changed from competitive to genuinely impressed. She admitted that she had underestimated him based on his appearance and occupation. James responded graciously that he was an ordinary person who simply loved history, just like her. The two began talking about specific historical periods and discovered they had much to discuss and many mutual interests in historical topics. The second round began with an entirely different format. The judges had arranged a series of historical artifacts in a display case, and the competitors were asked to examine them carefully. They would be given time to identify each object and explain its historical significance and time period. Dr. Moore moved toward the display with the confidence of someone who had spent years in museums and archives. However, James moved with equal certainty, his strategic mind already analyzing what he saw before him. The first artifact was an ancient Roman coin bearing the image of Emperor Nero. Dr. Moore stepped forward first and discussed the coin's date, its historical context, and the political situation during Nero's reign. She scored full points for her comprehensive answer. Then James was asked about a medieval sword. He examined it carefully, noting the style of craftsmanship, the materials used, and the approximate century it came from. His answer was equally detailed and showed remarkable knowledge about medieval weapon manufacturing and warrior culture. The audience leaned forward, captivated by both competitors' expertise displayed in this new format. Round after round of artifacts kept coming. There was a piece of ancient Egyptian pottery, a Byzantine religious icon, a fragment of a medieval tapestry, and dozens more. Some artifacts were obscure and challenging, requiring deep knowledge to identify properly. Dr. Moore answered most of the questions correctly, her scholarly background providing her with excellent training in artifact analysis. However, James also demonstrated remarkable skill in this area. His knowledge of specific historical periods, military equipment, and cultural artifacts was proving to be just as comprehensive as Dr. Moore's formal education had made hers. Then came an artifact that seemed to stump both of them initially. It was an ornate piece of metalwork from an ambiguous period, possibly medieval, or possibly from a different era entirely. Dr. Moore was uncertain about its exact origin and gave a somewhat tentative answer. James studied it much longer than he had studied the previous items. He closed his eyes for a moment, clearly searching his memory for information about this particular piece. Then he began to speak, describing in detail a specific type of Turkish-influenced metalwork that appeared in European collections during the 15th century. After the Byzantine Empire fell to Ottoman forces, his answer was incredibly specific and showed not just knowledge of the artifact itself, but understanding of the broader historical context that explained why it had certain design features. When the judges confirmed his answer was absolutely correct, the audience erupted in sustained applause. This was no longer just about answering questions correctly. This was about demonstrating real understanding of history, genuine passion for learning, and the ability to think deeply about how different historical periods and cultures had influenced each other. Dr. Moore once again looked impressed and somewhat humbled by James's knowledge. She had always believed that formal education was the best path to expertise. But here was someone proving that passion and dedication could forge knowledge just as effectively. As the second round progressed, the score remained extremely close. Both competitors answered most questions correctly, though occasionally one would gain a slight advantage on particularly difficult artifacts. By the time the final artifacts were presented, James had maintained his slim 1-point lead from the first round. The competitive spirit between them had transformed into something more collaborative. They were no longer trying to beat each other, but rather engaged in a genuine dialogue about history itself. The judges announced the scores at the end of the second round. James had accumulated 43 points in this round, while Dr. Moore had earned 41 points. This meant that going into the final round, James was ahead by 3 points total. The audience was now genuinely excited about how this competition would conclude. This was no longer a predictable outcome. The final round would determine everything, and either competitor could potentially win depending on how it played out. During the second intermission, several members of the audience approached the stage to talk to both James and Dr. Moore. A young woman in her 20s told James that his performance had inspired her to pursue history more seriously, even though she worked in a completely different field. An elderly man approached Dr. Moore and complimented her knowledge, while also admitting that he had been initially skeptical about James and had completely changed his mind. The entire atmosphere of the event had shifted from light entertainment to something genuinely meaningful and inspiring. Dr. Moore and James stood together on the stage, looking out at the crowd. They were no longer enemies competing for victory. They had become something like colleagues, or even friends, united by their shared passion for historical knowledge. The host returned and announced that they would now move into the final and most challenging round. This round would be different from the previous two because it would require creative thinking and problem solving, not just factual recall. The judges had prepared a complex historical mystery that needed to be solved using carefully provided clues. The third round was presented as an elaborate mystery puzzle. The judges had created a fictional historical scenario based on real historical events and figures. The competitors were given a series of clues that they would need to interpret and combine to solve the mystery. The mystery involved an anonymous letter that had been discovered in the British Museum's archives, written in an archaic style and making references to historical events that could be traced back to a specific time period and set of political circumstances. The first clue mentioned a hidden treasure and a royal court in turmoil. The second clue referenced a specific naval battle and the rise of a particular political faction. The third clue mentioned an exile and a return to power. Both competitors were given paper and pen to work with. They were allowed to confer with the judges if they needed clarification on any of the clues. The goal was to identify the time period, the historical figures involved, the events being referenced, and the historical significance of what was being described. Dr. Moore started by listing the clues methodically and trying to organize them into a logical framework. She drew lines connecting different pieces of information, creating a visual map of connections. Her academic training had taught her to break down complex problems into manageable components and build understanding systematically. James, meanwhile, seemed to be approaching the problem differently. He was pacing back and forth slightly, not writing very much, but clearly thinking deeply about the information presented. After about 20 minutes of thinking time, Dr. Moore raised her hand and began presenting her theory. She suggested that the clues referred to the Wars of the Roses in 15th century England, specifically related to the Battle of Bosworth Field and the rise of the Tudor dynasty. She explained how the clues connected to Richard III's final battle, his death, and Henry VII's ascension to the throne. Her analysis was logical, well-organized, and historically sound. The audience listened intently as she laid out her interpretation of the mystery. The judges nodded thoughtfully and asked if anyone else had a different interpretation. James had not raised his hand yet. He continued pacing and thinking, his brow furrowed in concentration. Then, after several more minutes, he finally signaled that he wanted to present his theory. The entire audience became silent, waiting to hear what the guard had to say about this complex historical puzzle. James began by agreeing with Dr. Moore's general time period, but suggesting a different specific focus. He argued that the mystery was not primarily about the Wars of the Roses itself, but rather about a specific incident involving a potential hidden heir and a debate about legitimacy of rule. He suggested that the mystery referenced the case of the princes in the tower, the two young sons of Edward IV, who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances while in the custody of Richard III. James explained that various theories had suggested different fates for these young princes, including the possibility that they had been hidden away rather than killed. James continued by proposing that the anonymous letter might have been written by someone close to these princes, possibly attempting to leave a record of what had truly happened to them. He explained how the clues in the message connected to specific historical records and theories about what had occurred. His interpretation was not just answering the surface question, but rather demonstrating sophistication, understanding of historical ambiguity, and the way historians must work with incomplete information to construct theories about the past. The judges exchanged glances and began conferring quietly among themselves. The audience held its breath. This was clearly a more nuanced and thoughtful answer than Dr. Moore's, which, while correct in its basic framework, had not engaged with the deeper historical mystery being presented. After a lengthy consultation, the judges announced that James's answer demonstrated superior historical thinking and problem-solving skills. He had earned the maximum points for this portion of the final round. Dr. Moore accepted this outcome with grace and good humor. She actually leaned over and told James quietly that she was genuinely impressed by his ability to think beyond the obvious answer. The second part of the final round involved the competitors having to create their own historical mystery for the other person to solve, using 5 clues that they themselves would compose. This required not just knowledge of history, but also creative thinking, the ability to structure information in a way that was challenging but ultimately solvable. Dr. Moore went first, creating a mystery about a famous explorer who had been unfairly blamed for a historical catastrophe. She carefully crafted 5 clues that were challenging but fair, and she watched as James worked through them. He eventually arrived at the correct answer, though he had to ask for one clarification. Then it was James's turn to create a mystery for Dr. Moore. He created a mystery about a lesser-known historical figure whose contributions had been almost completely forgotten by history, yet who had influenced a major historical event in subtle but significant ways. As Dr. Moore worked through James's mystery, she found it incredibly well-constructed. Each clue connected to the others in ways she had not immediately anticipated. She appreciated the creativity and the depth of thinking that had gone into creating this puzzle. When she finally arrived at the correct answer, she told James that he had not only demonstrated extensive historical knowledge, but also exceptional analytical and creative abilities. The final round scores were announced, and James emerged victorious overall by a narrow margin. The announcement of James's victory sent shockwaves through the audience. People jumped to their feet, applauding not in the way they would applaud a winner proving they were superior to a loser, but in the way people applaud when something unexpected and genuinely inspiring has just happened before them. The camera flashes went off repeatedly, and reporters in the crowd immediately began scrambling to get interviews. What had started as a lighthearted event between two people from different walks of life had become a powerful and moving demonstration about the nature of intelligence, expertise, and the value of unconventional paths to knowledge. The museum director took the stage and handed James a large novelty check, representing the substantial donation that would go to his chosen charity. James had selected the British Library Foundation, an organization dedicated to making historical resources accessible to the general public. As he held the check, he thanked Dr. Moore publicly for being such a gracious and formidable competitor. He expressed his genuine respect for her dedication to education, and for her willingness to engage with him as a true intellectual, equal rather than dismissing him based on his appearance or occupation. Dr. Moore stood and embraced James, a gesture that captured the respectful and collaborative spirit that had emerged during the competition. She spoke to the crowd, telling them that this event had taught her an important lesson. She admitted that she had arrived at the museum with preconceived notions about where intelligence and expertise came from. She had believed that formal education and academic credentials were the primary markers of knowledge. This competition had shown her that passion, dedication, and strategic thinking could produce expertise that was just as legitimate and valuable as anything earned through traditional educational paths. She praised James's intelligence and told the audience that they should not judge people's capabilities based on their jobs or appearances. The local news stations that had covered the event reported extensively on what had happened. By the next morning, the story had spread across the internet and social media platforms. Videos of the competition began going viral, with people watching and rewatching the moments where James had answered difficult questions or solved the complex historical mysteries. Comments poured in from people all over the world, sharing how the story had affected them. Many people talked about how they had been inspired to pursue knowledge in areas they were passionate about. Even if it was not part of their official job or educational background, several educational institutions contacted James, asking if he would be willing to speak at their schools about his unconventional path to expertise. A major publishing company reached out to both James and Dr. Moore, proposing that they co-author a book about the history of education and unconventional learning methods. Universities inquired about whether James might be interested in teaching seminars on military history or medieval cultures, positions that would not require a degree but would be based on his demonstrated knowledge and expertise. The impact on James's life was profound. He continued his work as a royal guard because he genuinely loved the tradition and the honor associated with it. However, he now had opportunities that had never been available to him before. He began giving lectures at various cultural institutions about history. He started writing articles for historical journals and magazines. Most importantly, he was no longer invisible. People recognized that beneath his uniform and professional composure was a brilliant mind with something valuable to contribute to public discourse about history and learning. Dr. Moore also found that this experience changed her perspective on education and expertise. She began incorporating more discussion of unconventional learning methods into her teaching. She started mentoring students who came from non-traditional backgrounds, encouraging them to pursue knowledge through whatever means worked best for them. She and James became friends and colleagues, collaborating on research projects and attending historical lectures together. What had begun as a competition had become a genuine intellectual partnership, based on mutual respect and shared passion. The museum that had organized the event found that this single competition had transformed its public perception and attendance. People wanted to visit the place where this remarkable encounter had happened. The museum curator decided to create a permanent exhibition dedicated to unconventional paths, to expertise in the nature of intelligence. They displayed information about both James and Dr. Moore's approaches to learning history, and they used their story as a teaching tool to help visitors understand that knowledge and expertise could come from many different places. 6 months after the competition, James received a message from a major academic journal, asking him to submit a piece of his analysis about the historical mysteries that had been presented during the final round. The journal was interested in publishing his interpretations and his approach to historical problem solving. This was the highest form of validation for someone in the academic community. James was being recognized not just as someone with impressive knowledge, but as someone who could contribute meaningful analysis to formal historical scholarship. Dr. Moore wrote the foreword to the journal article, publicly endorsing James's work and acknowledging his significant contributions to historical thinking. She wrote about how her encounter with James had reminded her that the academic world sometimes became too closed off, too focused on credentials and institutional affiliations, and not focused enough on genuine expertise in the pursuit of truth. She argued that the historical community would be stronger if it welcomed perspectives from people like James, people who had pursued knowledge through unconventional but thoroughly dedicated means. A year after the competition, the National History Museum decided to host a special anniversary event celebrating what had happened. They invited both James and Dr. Moore back to the museum, and they asked them to participate in a panel discussion about expertise, learning, and the changing landscape of education. The museum was packed once again, but this time the atmosphere was completely different. These were not people coming to watch two people compete. These were people who wanted to hear from two intellectuals who had something important to teach them about how to approach learning and how to respect knowledge in all its forms. During the panel discussion, James spoke about his journey as a royal guard who loved history. He explained how he had used the quiet moments of his job to absorb knowledge through audiobooks and reading. He talked about how he had never felt that he needed permission from an institution to pursue expertise. He encouraged the audience members to find their own paths to knowledge, paths that fit their lives and circumstances rather than forcing themselves into traditional educational structures that might not work for them. His words resonated powerfully with people in the audience, particularly those who had felt excluded by traditional educational institutions or who had felt like they could not pursue their intellectual interests because of their economic circumstances or life situations. Dr. Moore spoke about how her initial judgment of James had been unfair and based on unconscious biases about where real knowledge came from. She had been humbled by the experience and had spent the past year reflecting on how formal education could sometimes create barriers rather than openings. She had been working with educational researchers to understand how school systems could be more inclusive, and how they could recognize and validate diverse forms of learning. She encouraged teachers in the audience to look beyond grades and credentials when assessing their students' actual capabilities and potential. She emphasized that true expertise sometimes came from unexpected places, and that it was the responsibility of educators to keep their minds open. The discussion turned to what had changed since the competition. Both James and Dr. Moore shared their experiences of how the event had opened doors and created unexpected opportunities. However, they also emphasized that the real value of what had happened was not about them personally, but about what it meant for society's understanding of intelligence and expertise. They discussed how too often people's capabilities were limited by others' perceptions of what they should be able to do based on their job, their background, or their demographic characteristics. They argued that this was a waste of human potential and that society needed to fundamentally rethink how it valued and recognized expertise. An hour into the discussion, members of the audience were invited to share their own stories. A middle-aged man stood up and talked about how watching the competition had inspired him to pursue his passion for ancient Egyptian history, which he had abandoned 20 years earlier because he felt like it was not a practical or legitimate pursuit. He had since spent 2 years studying intensively and had become an expert on the subject, volunteering his time at museums and educational institutions. He credited James's example for showing him that it was never too late to pursue knowledge that you were passionate about. Regardless of your job or your stage in life, a young woman shared how watching the competition had changed her perception of what careers were available to her. She had been told throughout her life that she was not academic enough for certain paths. But watching James demonstrate brilliant academic thinking while being a royal guard had shown her that people could be multifaceted. She had started pursuing both a career in engineering and advanced study of Renaissance art history, something she had always wanted to do but thought was incompatible with her planned career path. She expressed her gratitude to both James and Dr. Moore for showing her that these things did not have to be mutually exclusive. An elderly educator in the audience stood up and spoke about how this competition and its aftermath had influenced educational policy discussions in the United Kingdom. He reported that there were now more programs designed to recognize and validate diverse forms of expertise in learning. Schools were beginning to partner with community organizations to create opportunities for students to learn from people like James, people who had become experts through non-traditional paths. The educational landscape was slowly changing, and this man credited the competition and the story that had emerged from it as being a significant catalyst for that change. As the discussion concluded, James and Dr. Moore were asked what their relationship had become. They both smiled and spoke about genuine friendship and ongoing intellectual collaboration. They had written articles together, they consulted on each other's research projects, and they remained in close touch. Their relationship had transformed from an initial competitive dynamic into something much deeper and more meaningful. They were united by their shared love of history and their shared commitment to challenging assumptions about where expertise came from and how it should be recognized. Audience gave them a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. People were not just applauding their accomplishments or celebrating their victory in the competition. They were applauding what their story represented about human potential, about breaking down barriers, and about the possibility for people from different backgrounds to respect each other and learn from each other. The impact of their competition and friendship had extended far beyond the museum, into educational institutions, into public discourse about learning and expertise, and into the hearts of countless people who had been inspired by their story to pursue their own intellectual passions more boldly. As James and Dr. Moore left the museum that evening, they reflected on how much their lives had changed in just 1 year. What had begun as a simple trivia competition had become a movement of sorts, challenging the way society thought about expertise and intelligence. They recognized that they had been given an incredible opportunity to make a difference in the world by simply being authentically themselves, and by being willing to engage with each other as genuine intellectual equals. They understood that their legacy would not be about who won a competition, but about how they had inspired others to pursue knowledge, to respect diverse forms of expertise, and to never limit themselves based on others' expectations or preconceived notions about what people in certain professions or backgrounds were capable of achieving.